Hi and welcome to the 30-minute Q&A. In this one I have a question from Andy and I'll read that one first. So he asked about applying training in traditional Tai Chi Chuan weapons for use in self-defense. Why is it still useful to learn these ancient weapons? How will we adapt what we learned to use it on the street with a makeshift weapon and so on? So as you know, I teach a traditional style of Tai Chi Chuan, Practical Tai Chi Chuan, because it needs to be useful, obviously. And part of that training is the three traditional weapons, which is the broadsword, the long sword, regular sword with a double edge, and then you have the spear, or you could also use that as a staff training, but it's basically a spear. So three different kinds of weapons. And his question is, what's the use in modern times? Well, several reasons, and I'll try to list a number of them and hope that it makes sense. So first of all, whenever society breaks down, you invariably see edged weapons and impact weapons make a return. Whenever people grab or go for anything that is useful as a weapon, and we could call it improvised weapons, makeshift weapons, and so on. Whenever that kind of stuff happens, it tends to fall in one of those categories that I said before, which is similar to a saber, which has many of the qualities of an axe-like or machete-like weapon. Sorry. Whereas the sword, the straight sword, is much more interesting, for instance, as a stabbing weapon. And then you have the spear or staff. You can use it as, if you don't have a spear point, you can use it as a staff. But that would be a two-handed weapon, a longer range weapon. So these kind of things are still available to us pretty much all over the world. You go to different, as I know you do, you go to third world countries and so on. These are the kind of weapons that you will very quickly see come out when violence happens. Not necessarily when society breaks down, but just as a general rule, because not everybody has access to a firearm or a more effective weapon. Throughout human history, these are the kinds of weapons that were always used. You can go back thousands of years and you will find similar weapons. Whether it's a sword that is more meant for stabbing, like for instance, the Romans used the gladius, a short sword that was mainly meant to use as a stabbing weapon. If you wanted to kill with it, you didn't really use it to slash and hack like we would with a saber, because the weapon didn't lend itself all that well to that. However, for stabbing it was really good, and then we get into the whole tactics of how they fought. That's a different topic. But you would also find weapons more along the lines of sabers. When you start using the saber, which has a lot of slashing and chopping motions in the style that we practice, and you try to draw the parallels between how you use, for instance, an axe, you'll see that there are similarities, large similarities, more similarities than that there are differences when you compare it to, for instance, the straight sword. Because with an axe, stabbing is not going to be all that effective. So it's a different type of weapon and you use it differently, and saber work is going to help you with that. Two-handed weapons, anything that you can grab that requires the use of two hands, and then our spear techniques are going to come in handy. So the first thing is that you need to be familiar with the type of weapon that before you can use it effectively to defend yourself, obviously. And for that, the training we do is, in my opinion, excellent. I don't think you'll be walking around, for me here, in my case, in Belgium or in Brussels or Antwerp, with a saber or a spear in my hand. Well, I would, but I wouldn't go far before I get arrested or shot. So that's not likely to happen. However, if you spend a little bit of time being aware of your surroundings, you'll notice that even in urban environments, even in modern Western societies, there are a multitude of different types of improvised weapons that you can use that have the same or similar qualities to the three traditional weapons that we use. So in that aspect, I think the training is very efficient in helping you get used to those kinds of weapons. We spend a lot of time on our forms, and that does many things, but one of the main things it does, it lets you get acquainted with the way you manipulate that weapon. For instance, in saber form, you get used to doing the high blocks and following up with that chop to the neck and so on. You get used to committing to stabbing by putting your whole body weight in it. You learn to advance and retreat, which is something you typically need to do with such a weapon, and do so in a tactical way as opposed to just jumping forward and backwards and so on. So that is very clearly practiced in the saber form. When you look at the sword form, and as you know, when you start learning, you finished with learning the saber form, you switch to learning the sword form. The first few months are often very difficult because you're using the sword as a saber, rigid, chopping, and not fluid enough, which isn't the goal. It needs to be more fluid than the saber. Why? Well, it has two edges to begin with. That's the first thing. Second thing, it's not as top heavy. It has a different balance than a saber. So you use it differently as well. And then you spend a little bit more time training your sword forms, and then you get used to manipulating that kind of weapon. And the way I compare it to very often with my students is that you compare it to an axe and a scalpel. It's not a perfect comparison, but it helps them get away from that mind shift of using the movements from the saber and then using them with the sword itself. So that's why I like to make that comparison, so they understand that it's a different kind of weapon and that the characteristics that are different from the saber are something you need to take into account as you start practicing. If you don't, you don't have to, but then you are using every weapon as if it's the same. It isn't. The differences are just as important as the similarities. Randy's law, which I've explained many times before. And again, this comes, Randy was a Filipino martial arts practitioner, and that was where he was talking, what he was talking about, the different weapons that they use there, how the differences are equally important as opposed to just looking at the similarities. And this, as I've explained before, has to do with the way in Filipino martial arts they often teach weapons and the way the systems are built up from the ground up. And then we get to the spear form. One of the main reasons why I very much like to practice the spear form and like to teach it is because it's the first time that we use both hands to manipulate a weapon. The spear, it's pretty long. It's not a short spear at all. So in our forms, we use a relatively heavy weapon. It creates a long lever arm, which is hard to control. So if you want to do the spear correctly, you're going to have to develop really good mechanics. You have to develop really good body mechanics to make your body do the work as opposed to your arms, which, as you know, is one of the mistakes you see so many of the practitioners in our style do. It's all arm dominant. They don't use the whole body. They focus too much on what the arms are doing, or they disconnect the body mechanics from the torso and the legs from what their arms are doing. That disconnect then makes it a whole lot less powerful and strong than it could be if it is done correctly. There are many things that I learned as far as body mechanics are concerned in our style by practicing the spear form, because they emphasize it so much more. For instance, using the posterior chain, the muscles and the connections on the back side of your body, because we have specific movements in the spear form that you don't find to the same degree emphasized in the other forms, whether it's the other weapon forms or the hand form. They're not as emphasized. Why? Because you don't carry that heavy weight in your hand, and you don't have to create that long lever in the other forms. In the spear form, you have to. So the posterior chain is stressed so much more, and the way you rotate around the hips, the way you control the spine, and the way you have interaction between both hands, all those kinds of things are emphasized tremendously because of that weight and lever that you have to manipulate with both hands in the spear form. So that's another way in which I think that we benefit from it, is that it improves our body mechanics also for all the other ways, the other weapons and the empty hand stuff.
So
It's a little bit of a sidetrack here, but bringing it back to what I said before. So the third category of weapons was long-range weapons. Whenever you pick up anything that you can use two hands with, then the mechanics of the spear form, they come into play. And then whether it's a broomstick, whether it's I don't know, whatever you can pick up that is a little bit longer than a traditional saber or sword would be. You use both hands. Well, there you go. So that is the first big part, in my opinion, is that you learn to manipulate different kinds of weapons that have different characteristics that are universally applicable. You'll find throughout all cultures in the world, you will find weapons that are more or less like the sword, mainly meant for stabbing and cutting. And then you have weapons like the saber, where you have the slashing and chopping movements that are much more emphasized because of the shape of the blade. And then you have long techniques, longer reach weapons like the spear and so on. You have all these different kinds where it's two hands on the weapon as opposed to one. So you'll find it all over, from Asia, go to any other country, and you will eventually run into those kinds of weapons. Sometimes historically speaking, because in most modern cultures, it's frowned upon if you use those kinds of weapons in everyday life. But as you know, you go to Africa, you go to certain parts of Asia, that's still very much alive. It's just very much alive. For instance, giving you an example, certain parts of China where they have some of the terrorist attacks that I've seen over there was just guys with machetes and short, I think it was axes and knives, that they just ran into a school and started killing kids and teachers and so on. That's how they did their attacks there. So if you're not used to manipulating those weapons and working with them, you also don't understand how they can be used against you. And that's one of the other reasons why I think it's important to keep on training this kind of thing, is because you have to understand the weapon. Now, you cannot train with every single weapon that is out there. Very few of us will be able to train with the certain kinds of automatic machine guns that are available. We won't train with that. So, but I think we can pretty much understand what it means when the lead starts flying our way, that it's not a good thing. But the three main categories of weapons that we practice, those are things that you, like I said, it's more easy to find weapons that share those similarities, so that if you face them, you understand the danger that you're in. And if you do have to go up against somebody wielding such a weapon, then you hopefully have a slightly better chance than somebody who doesn't understand that kind of stuff. One of the things I've written and talked about a lot is the myths that exist in the self-defense and martial arts world about so many other things we see. For instance, the video I just released was about the big question that you always get, for instance, when police officers shoot somebody and they shoot in center mass, and then you get outrage from the public. Why didn't you shoot him in the leg? Well, there's a variety of valid reasons for that. And in that video, I showed that bank robber getting shot in the leg, and he died, he bled out. Turns out we have arteries in the legs too. Turns out that it's a smaller target, it's harder to hit. Turns out that you shoot at a downward angle and it can ricochet. And turns out that if legs are moving the whole time because somebody's not standing conveniently still for you, it's a more difficult target to hit. So there's a bunch of reasons. The same applies to those different categories of weapons. Many people do not understand what it is like to face somebody who is, for instance, wielding a machete. It's about this long. It shares many similarities with the way we use a saber. And you mostly, when people use that, you rarely see stabbing type attacks. Rarely. You most of the time see some sort of slashing or chopping attack, just like we practice in our saber form. If you see somebody rearing up to do the overhand strikes and come at you like that, you at the very least are familiar with the angles of attack and you know where the danger is. You know how to handle that in a sense that it's not the first time. Obviously you need to practice applications, but it's not the first time you've seen that. So at the very least you are aware that just bringing up your arm to block is not going to cut it. You'd be amazed at some of the people that still believe that kind of stuff. So training with the weapons also helps you understand what you can do when they are used against you, or potentially used against you, or when you see somebody using that on somebody and you are the third party and you want to intervene. At the very least, you are more aware of the dangers, where you want to be, where you do not want to be. For instance, one of the classical things that you often see, and it's one of the things that we practice, it's difficult, but we practice long range weapons against shorter range weapons. One of the partners has a spear, the other one has a saber or a sword, and see what happens. And it's surprising to some people when they assume that the guy with the long range weapon will always win. It's difficult getting past that spear point. I wouldn't want to be the guy who has to do that in real life, because it's rather difficult, especially when you're facing somebody who's trained and knows how to use it. And if you do that, you have to do that. It's one of the scariest things I can imagine. But what a lot of people don't understand is that once you get past that spear point, that guy with his spear, he's in a whole lot of trouble. It's not going to be a good day for him, because he's holding a weapon that doesn't help him all that much anymore. And you can start doing whatever you want to do to him, because he's either going to have to create some more distance and get away from you, or you'll be able to strike out and land any technique that you want with him. But until you've had somebody charge at you with a weapon like that, you don't really understand what it's like. If you don't practice the differences in distances, how you can use a long range weapon against somebody wearing a shorter weapon, it's very easy to assume that the guy with the long range weapon is at the distinct advantage that you cannot beat. A lot of people think that's true. Same thing, the whole classic thing, a gun against a knife. There's a famous tool or drill, which I've written about before, which is very misunderstood, but which showed very clearly that at a distance of about 21 feet, if you have a firearm, it's in its holster, and the only thing you do there is when he starts running at you with a knife, and that's when you start drawing and you try to shoot him, that he's very likely to get to you before you manage to fire the trigger. 21 feet is a relatively long distance. Let's say it's 10 feet, that's still relatively far away from you. That's outside of reach. If you need to deploy that firearm, you're very, very unlikely to do so in time before you get cut or stabbed. Despite this having been shown for many years with many examples, both in training and in real life encounters, a lot of people still think that a gun beats a knife every single time. And it's the same thing with the traditional weapons, the classical weapons. It's training with them helps you understand how you can use them against other people to defend yourself, but also how they can be used against you, which is, I think, in my opinion, the most critical part nowadays. Because if it's used against you, for instance, we've had the London terror attacks several times with guys with long knives just started hacking away and stabbing people and going at them. We've had several incidents in Germany as well. Guy with an axe going after people in the street, guy in a train trying to stab people and chop them up. And these are weapons that fall in those three categories. So if you don't have any understanding of what this is like, what the ranges are like, what the reaches of such a weapon, what the dangers are, because something that doesn't look like much as far as an injury is concerned can actually be life-threatening if you don't understand what it's like and how bad it can get. So that's, in my opinion, one of the most important things about it. There is another aspect to it, and I've mentioned this before, but I gotta get back to it, Randy's law. So Randy's law is the differences are just as important as the similarities. This is true for the three basic weapons. There are more similarities than there are differences when you look at a saber and a straight sword. They have a lot more similarities than they have differences. However, the differences that do exist are equally important than the similarities. Now, to a degree, you can use techniques from the saber for the sword and so on, but certain techniques are how should I put that? You can more easily apply certain techniques if they are used with the correct weapon, the weapon that capitalizes on the specific design differences from the one weapon to the other. For instance, you could try to do the double hand saber techniques that we do on a straight sword. You'll be cutting into your own hand. It'll be counterproductive, but you could do it. It's possible. It's not a good idea, but you could do it. With the saber, obviously, it's a much better idea because the backside is not sharpened, so you can actually put that pressure on there and use your hand on that. So you could start doing a bunch of overhead techniques with the straight sword and try to block that way and so on, like we do with the saber. But if that fails, you're actually going to cut into your own head or your shoulder or what have you if the guy hits hard enough, which isn't that much of an issue with the saber, even though it might not be all that enjoyable. So again, the differences are just as important between the weapons. Same thing when you look at a double hand weapon, which is a spear. Once you switch from one hand to using two hands, everything changes. The mechanics change, the way that you manipulate the weapon change, the way the ranges change and so on. So those differences, in my opinion, are where the real learning is. That's where you need to spend most of your time. I've said this before, don't learn the same thing twice. Yes, you can stab with all three weapons. You can stab with the saber, the spear, and the sword, but it'll be slightly different with each different weapon. So focus on the differences. Spot the similarities, focus on the differences. Now, the same type of thinking applies to improvised weapons, because a saber is not a machete. Even though they share similarities, it's not exactly the same thing. And if you start looking at, for instance, I don't know, a hammer would be more similar to a saber than it would be to a sword because it's top heavy. However, it's still not a saber. You can do similar techniques with it, but the mechanics will still be different because the leverage created as you swing it is very different from a saber, because of the weight distribution and so on. It's more closely related to what the saber work teaches us as opposed to the sword work, but it's still not exactly the same. And those differences are where the knowledge lies. And it's one of the things that as you know, I've spent a little time focusing on, seeing how you can advance your understanding of using the weapons when you look at those kinds of things. Here's my point. If you want to apply everything you learn about the traditional weapons for self-defense in a modern environment where you have improvised weapons to your that are available, or that you know that you might have to use and you want to train with that, focus on that. See how it works. Spend some time grabbing whatever improvised weapon you would like to use and hit something with it, stab something with it. Silly example maybe, but just look at the hand grip. Grab the weapon, the saber you used to train with, and then just go grab any other tool that is about the same size. It could be just a broomstick that you break in half, whatever. Try to stab with the same thing. You'll notice some glaring differences that'll be in your face the first time you try to stab something with it. Because the handle is not the same, the texture of the grip is not the same, the way you hold your wrist is not completely the same, and all of a sudden you have to stab somebody with that, and your grip fails. So that's one example. Same thing if you grab a long stick, doesn't matter what it's like, and you try to do a high block with it against the downward strike, and you do the block at an angle as we've learned, and so on. See what happens. See what happens. And you might be surprised that the fact that it's a whole lot lighter than a saber changes the way that you do that upper block, and also changes the resistance that you can give to the weapon coming at you at a vertical angle, and also changes the angle at which the slope that you have to create with that stick to actually get the deflection going, as opposed to that he powers through and hits you anyway. And that's just a couple of examples of different kind of things that you have that illustrate that the differences are equally important. I'm not saying that you can't make it work. I'm saying that if you want to train our traditional weapons for self-defense, spend time training with those non-traditional weapons that have similarities with them. Spend time training with the improvised makeshift weapons that you think you might have to use. It doesn't have to be, you know, years and years and years of training, but spend the odd afternoon maybe just grabbing a stick or a shovel, whatever, and see if you can make it work. See what happens, and you'll learn a lot more that way than just theorizing and thinking, well, you know, it'll be the same because it looks the same and blah blah blah. And that's not how it works. That's in my opinion, that's a really poor way of viewing self-defense. If you just assume that it'll just translate completely from what you learn in the traditional weapons, and then it'll translate directly into the makeshift weapons that you might have to use. So that's the main. Those are the main things that I think are very important when you look at transitioning from traditional weapons to using them for self-defense. That said, and perhaps the aspect that is mostly ignored, what I see nowadays, it's better than a couple of years before, but it's still an aspect that gets ignored. If you use a weapon for self-defense, you have to be justified. We live in a modern society. There's cameras everywhere. Even if you don't think somebody's filming you, there's a high likelihood that you will be filmed. Even if they don't have the footage of you using whatever weapon, improvised or other, on somebody, but they do have the footage of you 2 blocks further out running away with blood on your hands. Guess what? They're going to find you, and you'll have to face justice system and fight that fight actually for your freedom and proving that you acted in self-defense. It's a far cry when you defend yourselves empty-handed in most justice systems than when you compare it to when you use whatever sort of tool or weapon to defend yourself. Typically, in most countries, that tends to be viewed as very negative. They tend to frown upon that. So you need to be able to articulate verbally why exactly did you use that weapon. Well, just because I know how to use that, that's not a good answer. So if you consider using our traditional training with weapons for self-defense, spend time, you know, getting to know your legal system and thinking about, well, what if I use this improvised weapon that I see here? Not just how would I use it, but also when am I justified in using it, and what if I use it and then the police shows up and I have to explain myself? Well, what are you going to say? And as always, if we can accept that, you know, the classical expression in martial arts, the way you train is the way you fight, and I tend to agree with that to a certain degree. If we can accept that for all the other kinds of training, maybe accept that for these aspects as well. The way you perform after the incident is the way you train for it. If you don't train for it, don't expect to be all that great at answering questions from the police and district attorneys and what have you, because you've never practiced it, you've never prepared for it, you never thought it through, and then you're in maybe slightly traumatized because of the fact that you had to take somebody's life and you had to stab him, which is up close and personal, which is not as easy as it sounds. So for a variety of reasons, once you use that weapon training, you're gonna have to be able to, you know, make it work afterwards in a way that keeps you out of prison. So be justified. Know what that means, being justified in using a weapon for self-defense. And it changes from one place to the other. You travel a lot, you go to Asia, it's not the same as if you go back to the UK, it's not the same if you come to Belgium and try it. So understand what that means, legal self-defense, especially when weapons are involved. If you don't know where to start, talk to a police officer. First thing, explain why you're doing it, so he doesn't start following you around and seeing you as a potential killer. Talk to a defense attorney, somebody who pleads self-defense cases. You don't want to talk to a divorce lawyer about self-defense. It's not their specialty. Everybody has a specialty. Talk to somebody who actually pleads cases and gets people off, preferably. So you get good information, solid information. Anyway, that's it. So I hope that answers your questions. If anything's not clear, as always, leave me a comment on Patreon, and we'll talk some more about it. Thanks.